Awesome. Hello and welcome to the 19th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO of Project Medtech, and today we'll be hearing from one of my good friends, Giovanni Lauricella, for a discussion and really a state of the union on hiring and capital in medtech. First, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant with FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. Built on 40+ years of collective experience developing compliant systems in the medical device industry, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our guest of the hour here, Giovanni Lauricella. Giovanni is currently the co-founder and managing partner at Lifeblood Capital, and he's also a partner at Project Medtech as well, and hosts one of our Project Medtech podcasts. His podcast is called Medtech Money, where he interviews entrepreneurs and investors and others in that space with the goal of demystifying and raising and investing capital in the medtech space. So with that being said, Giovanni, if you wouldn't mind, I covered it at a high level, but just a brief intro into who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Dwayne. So my name is Giovanni Lauricella and managing partner of Lifeblood Capital. For the past 11 or so years, all that we've done is focus in medtech startups. And it's really from a people as well as money perspective. We build teams from end to end, meaning from very early stage R&D through late stage or multinational commercialization. And then how we really got tied into the financial world is over the years, VCs would hire us to put in their CEOs or change management for their portfolio companies. And over time, organically, we actually started developing this VC network. And so it became pretty obvious that startups have to raise money in order to hire teams. And when they raise money, they usually make a promise to investors on what that money is going to achieve. And so right after they get the money, they have to hire the teams and then hopefully achieve that milestone. So we tied that idea together and we're able to help medtech startups with both people as well as money. And over the course of the past 11-ish years, helped roughly 500 startups build about 2,000 team members. And that's global, by the way. And then also roughly a little bit more than 55 companies raising roughly 220 million and ongoing. So that's us to date.
Awesome. Do you want to start with the money side of things or the hiring? Because I think logically in my head, it makes sense to start with money.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So for yourself, right? I mean, you've had, I think the 65th episode of Medtech Money was just released maybe this week or something like that. There's another 10 in the hopper. So you have, I don't know, almost 100 hours of interviewing VCs, entrepreneurs. Let's start at the basic level of how is fundraising for a medtech startup different than other types of companies?
So I think the fundamental mechanics are actually quite similar. It's really sales. I mean, there's several episodes you can go back into and you hear about first timers who've never raised capital before, and you got to get used to no's and you got to put together an organized plan of outreach. So I don't think the actual necessary process of reaching out or doing that Gatling gun approach of understanding and getting some of that feedback on your investability is different. I think where it really does differ with medtech is there's subsets within medtech. So what are we talking about with medtech? I personally know investors who pride themselves on investing in class 3 and they love the implantables or cardiovascular. They're medical device or medtech investors, but they won't invest in digital health. Or there's other investors who will invest in digital health as well as medical devices, but they'll go earlier on medical devices, but they have to show some sort of revenue on digital health. And then lastly, there's other ones that if they have a hardware system, fine, let's see if we can figure it out, but hardware is hard for a reason, and there's a lot more investors I shouldn't say more investors across the board, but there's lately a lot more investors going into the whole software as a service, software platforms in general. You hear a lot about artificial intelligence, et cetera. So I'll just throw a plug in there. Octopus Ventures out of London, for example, very well-known VC. They'll touch hardware, but it's really not their game. They really love the software stuff. And then if you go to a company like Andera Partners out of Paris in Germany, for example, they love the hard stuff, right? So MedTech has a different flavor. My learnings from all the people who have taught me are, you have to really know your audience of investors. Look at their portfolio, do their due diligence on the investors, and see if you actually fit in there. Because if you're reaching out to proclaimed software investors and you're building the next catheter, you're wasting your time.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's something important to understand, is that while MedTech, for some folks, MedTech seems so specific, but then once you drill down into MedTech, it's even more specific. And I think that was one of the takeaways. So I edit all of Giovanni's podcasts, so I listen to Giovanni talk a lot, and that's one of the themes in most of the episodes is, yeah, we do digital health. We don't do physical devices, or we do AI, but that's about it, right? So I think that's helpful to understand. Let's kind of walk through the evolution of a medtech startup, and we'll go money and talent on each level, right? So for us, a seed stage company, right? One, where are seed stage companies getting funding in medtech? Right? Is it just angel investors? Are there some VCs that go down to that level? Is there geographical restrictions if they are going down to that level? Let's start there. What does that look like? And then I'd love to know what that team looks like. And at what point there's this transition period of going full time happens. So let's start with seed and just the basic question of where they're getting money from.
So it's a good question, and that's why I love running this podcast. And I think one of my opening lines that I have with every guest is that there is no silver bullet or magic formula or mystery of how to actually raise or invest capital in medtech. And I've laughed harder and harder throughout each episode, because right when you think you can create this category or box, someone tells you a story that just breaks it. I mean, one of the later episodes that we just released with DSO, who is an artificial intelligence software company, raised a $1.2 million seed round. And then he even states in there, and DSO, if you're listening in, it's just how the whole episode works. It just is meant to be broken. There's always exceptions. We just threw a conference together, Dwayne, up in Akron a few weeks ago, and Mina Pham came in with a $10 million safe. But DSO says, realistically, it's in between that 1 to maybe 3 million. And we had other podcast guests who had raised anywhere between 1 to 3 million on a safe, right? So to answer your question on seed, I just learned actually from a future upcoming guest that there's hedge funds that are predominantly focused in public markets, right? Or even sometimes bigger assets. They're getting involved in private equity, or I should say private companies at an earlier stage. There's one that just does seed, Series A, as well as seed funding. Predominantly when you think of seed, it's usually family offices, could be certainly angel groups. There are some VCs out there that will dabble into that, and self-proclaimed early stage investors, where I think if we are looking for a box to put some of these VCs, once again, I'm going to separate them out, because you are hearing a lot more VCs getting involved in seed stage rounds when it comes to software or SaaS-based technologies. We're going back to hardware or medical devices. Typically, when you think of seed, it really is seed, or I should say the traditional version of seed, where it could be family and friends, angel groups, things like that, where it doesn't truly go much north of about 1.5 to 2 million. And I think I do have to break out the conversation between software and hardware, because what I've personally learned, and out of all the startups that I'm regularly dealing with, is they are two different paths. Raising for a software company versus raising for a hardware company. I think night and day may be extreme, but it's pretty far apart. So sometimes in seed, you're looking for sales reps because you are already generating revenue and you need to get it out there to get a beta. And it might be a big seed. Seed rounds in software companies, 5 million, 8 million. We had one company on there, it was a $12 million. I think we're about to release the episode coming up with Andreas Forsland.
Mm-hmm.
Cognition. It was a $12 million seed round because there was a big data play, even though there was a little bit of a hardware component. So you have VCs that can play in seed rounds with software and big data and AI and all the big buzzwords. Typically, you don't really see venture capital get too involved in seed rounds when it comes to more classical medical devices and hardware. And if they do, they're actually pretty open and adamant about the fact that it's usually within an entrepreneur that they've done great work with in the past or had an exit or just full on trust. A lot of the early stage investors in medical devices typically are in that Series A round. So going back into on the talent side for seed, typically speaking, seed is usually getting you to prototype. I mean, it's founders and R&D, realistically. Yeah. Very rarely do you start getting into ancillary functions beyond that. Maybe if you're really forward thinking, you might think about quality assurance. You'll definitely be starting to tack on some sort of consultants. But in terms of a plethora of full-time individuals in the seed stage, usually not. And if there are, it's R&D because you are really focused on the actual device or technology itself. On the software side, like I said, it's definitely R&D for sure, but you might even get involved in customer service or sales, because oftentimes, even in seed rounds, there's revenue generation before a Series A in a software company. So it might be a few more different style bodies in a seed-based company for software.
Okay. And in this early phase, I think, I don't remember what entrepreneur it was, but I had asked, hey, how do you compete with some of the large strategics in the space, right, for top talent at such an early phase? And he gave like a kind of a smart remark, but was also serious. He said, raise more money and pay them more. Just, I'd be curious on your insights. I mean, is that kind of what you're seeing? I mean, how do you attract some of this top talent to a seed stage company? When you may just not have enough to compete with those large companies. Is it as simple as raise more money and pay them more, or what are you seeing there?
So when you say, just to be clear, so you're talking about a breakdown in who can afford top talent, and if you're a young company, is cash strapped, how do you afford that top talent?
Yeah, it's specifically in this seed area, right? Because like at Series B, that company's de-risked a little bit. They're probably raising a lot of money. Someone's going to come in and say, hey, if I can get in at Series B, great, there's an exit. But at a seed stage, they could fail next round, the round after. I mean, I guess any startup can. But I'm just curious, at that early on, how are you making that pitch for that top talent? Is it equity?
So at seed, and I'll blend it, seed and Series A, because typically, once again, going to medical device, right? And we'll stick away from software for the time being. And if you want me to go into that, let me know. But for medical devices, when you're in that seed round, you're typically still in that founder and maybe slightly larger than founder stage. You're really focused on getting that prototype that you have a story to sell to go typically raise that Series A, where you can start building that team. And from a candidate perspective, if you're joining a company that early, it really is a mindset. It's not, once again, to use our line that we use in the podcast, it's not like a magic formula or silver bullet that you can find. It's really, there's people right now in Boston Scientific who have done amazing things in small projects that kind of act like startups. And even though their resume reads corporate, they've never shown their entrepreneurial spirit because no one gave them a chance, right? And if you really gave them a chance, they could probably do some amazing things. I've seen plenty of resumes had corporate, and all of a sudden someone gave them a shot in the startup and they did wonders. Other
Mhm.
times, obviously, it was a huge mistake because they're corporate people at the end of the day. Who's going to join a company at a seed stage? It's really more of like the candidate psychology. You're never really going to be able to compete with a Medtronic and their long-term incentives and their healthcare plans and all that stuff. So when you're at a seed stage for hiring people, you're never going to be able to compete on money. If you find the right person who wants to take the shot, and obviously incentivize them with equity, which is really the major lever that you're going to be having to pull. That's pretty much it, to be honest with you.
All right, that's good to know. Okay, so you're moving into the Series A, and like you said, you're starting to raise money to expand your team. And what is this? Is this when you kind of brought up like the development of the product, that kind of thing? Does commercial creep in here as well from a talent perspective? Assuming it's not like a class 1 medical device. Class 1, they're probably already in the market and their seed round, they probably need to start thinking about that. But class 2, class 3, I mean, something that's maybe not necessarily being sold just yet. They're going out to raise their Series A. Do you start to include commercial in there? Does that creep in the Series B?
Well, if once again, we're going to class 2, class 3 medical devices, when
Yeah.
you're talking about that Series B-ish, I mean, the joke is Series C stands for commercialization. Obviously, that doesn't work for every single company, but if you're working for your Series B, typically speaking, it sounds like it would be that valley of death where you're getting through a big pivotal trial or clinical validation. And I've seen other companies that are raising Series B to go commercial. If you're talking about talent, how early do you bring those on? I talk to a lot of international startups who are looking to enter the US, especially with the MDR change, or I should say the regulatory change with the MDRs being implemented over in Europe. There's a lot of startups globally who have this FDA focus now, and a lot of my work right now is actually hiring first-time employees in the United States for international companies. And oftentimes it may be that commercial leader. And you don't want to, and once again, it's if you can afford it, but you have to be able to design your company and your raise around that. So there are times where I've seen companies who aren't selling because they don't have regulatory clearance or approval for the next 18 months or 2 years, and they're already hiring their head of commercialization. Why? Numerous reasons. First and foremost, they come in here, they can start getting letters of intent from hospitals or clinics and actually start building up a valuation so that when the company needs to go out and raise more money, they can utilize that story to be able to help raise money out of letter of intent and things along those lines. And then also that head of commercialization who's on the ground here in the States, typically they know who their team may be. They might bring them over because sometimes these commercial organizations, they run in packs together. They work from company to company at times. And then also they know, or they should know at least, about some of the reimbursement challenges and where to go about either working with consultants or at a minimum understanding some of the feedback that they're going to get from the field on how to establish a very clean sales process so that all these things can be implemented or at least chipped away along the way as they're getting into FDA clearance or approval so that they can start commercializing very fluidly. So a big trend that I've been seeing is companies who have padded into their raise, meaning factored in how much people are going to cost, sometimes on a little bit of an earlier schedule, so that when they do get that FDA clearance or approval, they can hit the ground running and have some of that commercial team already on board anywhere between 6 months to a year.
Okay, got it. And so this listening to you talk and thinking about seed through Series A, how important is naming of the rounds within all this? And this extends beyond Series A, but naming it at the early stage, I've seen pre-seed, seed plus, Series A, a bridge round, right? Demystify this for us a little bit. What is, how important is this, and what are investors, because you speak to a lot of them, right? So what are their takes on this? I mean, does it really matter that much?
So I think for some reason, it matters more for software. There's proclaimed investors in the seed round for software companies. So like you said, pre-seed, seed, post-seed, seed plus. Those are, you hear a lot of that within the software world. We have good friends on our podcast who have raised Series A, Series A2, Series C, Series C2. And a lot of the topics that we've covered are, what is in a name? How important are they? And sometimes, when the world of classical devices, especially where it goes seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and then onward, or some sort of exit, those boundaries have been broken. And a lot of times, because there's these categorical investors who say, I'm Series A, or I'm Series C, or we invest up to Series B, when you put yourself in a box like that, it can be really tough. And I've personally talked to entrepreneurs who have wrongly called their rounds, and it also ended up hurting them for future raises, because when you go out and you say you're raising your Series D round of funding, it usually signals something else. But all of a sudden you realize that you're just about to go commercial, or you're maybe just commercial proof of concept, and all of a sudden, you're raising a Series D of 10 million when your Series D should be usually and typically a lot more. And those kind of bells and whistles make a lot of noise to investors that beg for a lot more questions rather than immediately have answers. So a lot of what I've heard from entrepreneurs is, when you reach out to your investors, sometimes they're saying, I'm raising a growth round, or I'm raising for a pivotal trial, and they're not necessarily classifying it as that seed or that Series A or Series B. Because if your raise has been super clean, if you've been very blessed and lucky to raise just enough in the seed round for a medical device to get you to prototype, for example, and then you're about to go raise a very healthy round or Series A that got you to design freeze and maybe your first in man to start an early feasibility trial, and you're going to go raise a $20-30 million Series B to go do a pivotal trial for clinicals, and then a whatever Series C, for example. When you have that ability to tell a very clean story, it makes sense. But there's been, and I don't know if it's a trend, but between bridge rounds and Series C and post seed and all these different names that have come in between, when I've actually had to return around strategies for companies who are raising, where they went out and they called it a Series A, and it was really a seed round. And their 250,000 that they first collected was really a family and friends, but they called or thought that was their seed round, and they were going to raise a Series A of $1 million. And the story that they were telling, and they were targeting VCs at Series A, was just really too early, and they were wasting their time and probably their money in some capacity, because they were going after VCs when they shouldn't be. They were telling too early of a story, thinking that they were something later. And then all that they had to do is tweak it and adjust it, call it a seed, recognize that the earlier round that they raised, which was the very first one, was a family and friends, which it truly was, and then tell a better story of what that seed round of funding was going to do. And all of a sudden they started raising properly. So names do matter, but more importantly, if you haven't structured the history of your raise, where you're into bridges and you're into Series A and Series A2s, for example, you don't necessarily lead with that, but you tell a very clean story of what the money's going for when you reach out to investors.
Okay, that's helpful. So we kind of talked about commercial, but I want to make sure we talk about, at each stage, the different talent, human talent that's needed, or that you kind of see. So if Series A is this, you're getting to a product that you're actually going to get approved or cleared by the FDA and sell it, and maybe commercialization's coming in. If I go to Series B, what are those? As you're building medtech companies, right? I mean, that's what you're doing. So at Series B, if I come to you and say, Giovanni, I'm going out to raise my Series B, and I'm trying to include the human resources I'm going to need in this, what are some things that you go through and go, Dwayne, you haven't thought about this position yet. You haven't thought about this person yet. You're going to need that person here. Is that kind of what the process is? And at Series B, what are those most important pieces?
Yeah, and I think that's when we were laughing with David Sylvan and Akron about, we feel like everyone's involved in medtech or everyone's an investor. It's just because we're super close to it, right? But realistically, once you're in medtech's very, very big. It could be small to the rest of the world, but it's a very, very big industry. And I'm going to keep on going back to this word that everyone hates. It depends, right? But for a Series B, if you're a heart valve or an implantable device that calls for, well, you're certainly a class 3 device, and you're going to go for a big pivotal trial, that Series B typically screams clinical, right? So you should really get your quality team in place. You should really be getting your clinical team in place. Certainly heavily considering if it's the time to either have a blended clinical regulatory position in one person who can then manage a really great regulatory consultant, or if you're internalizing the function with a dedicated regulatory person. You're constantly adding on to R&D because R&D is ever going until you're either creating next generations or simply a new product line after you've already commercialized the first one. But R&D is going to be tightening and also expanding, probably in more siloed roles. But you're going to need all your technical functions in place strongly with the Series B. Clinical, quality, regulatory. Start thinking heavily about reimbursement if you haven't already engaged reimbursement consultants. To start thinking about your codes and also what lies ahead in the future, because we've learned pretty strongly that it's no longer just about regulatory clearance or approval, it's reimbursement. So those operational and technical functions really need to be solidified in Series B. And once again, that I'm speaking from a class 3 medical device perspective. Series Bs for class 2 could very well be your commercialization round. Mm-hmm. If you've already submitted your 510K and you're coming up on your clearance from the FDA, you should have your whole functional team in some capacity, right? And then you're really looking towards how do you commercialize and where are you commercializing? Are you using a distributor? Well, and starting with the head of commercialization, are you splitting out the marketing function and sales function? And are you having a head of commercialization on top to run those siloed functions? Or are you maintaining that small company feel where everything's blended together, at least on the management side, until you get into some sort of individual sales rep and or distributor model? Those are the things that you might think about for a series, or I should say class 2-ish for a Series B.
Okay. Speaking of the commercial, because we're hitting on this a lot, but like you said, in order for a company to be successful, whether it's to exit somewhere or whether it's to actually own the product, commercialize it, and do a second iteration, maybe a different product, that kind of thing, you have to be able to sell it, right? And reimbursement's crazy important and everything like that. When you're looking for these commercial people, because I'm sure you're doing you're doing talent searches for some of these companies for their chief commercial officer, VP of sales, whatever it is, right? What are some of those key characteristics you're looking for there, or key backgrounds? Yeah, I guess I'm just curious. I oftentimes see a lot of chief commercial officers who spent a ton of time at Abbott, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and it's like, from an outsider's perspective, is that the only option? Is that all who you're looking for, is someone who spent 30 years at a strategic, or are there other folks coming from other? Is it do you pull people from other industries? Can you walk through a little bit about what you're looking for there? What makes a good commercial person there?
So I usually, especially when I'm interviewing for positions that I'm running, I ask my clients first and foremost when they're looking for a commercial leader, and not necessarily looking for the person who's knocking on every single door, driving the sales. They'll help drive the sales, but they really more building the business, where they're figuring out if they're going to hire sales reps in certain territories and distributors elsewhere. Or is it going to be a one-man, one-woman show and they're going to be responsible for everything, right? Or is this a direct-to-consumer play, very different, right? So there's different sales models. If you have and I ask my startups, I say, are you looking for someone with transferable skill sets as a sales leader who knows how to build a team, who understands how to put in processes for lead generation, whatever it may be? Or are you buying someone for their black book, their network, right? That's really my initial question, because it's a huge driver for understanding what candidate profile we're going after next. There's a huge difference between, I need a solid commercial leader, and we might be a surgical robotic company right now, and I don't care if they come from orthopedics or if they come from ophthalmology, or I want someone who understands how people work, how to structure a team, how to then put in together a really strong business plan that's going to lead a team motivationally, and then have all these execution artists who have the networks that we're really looking for, allow them to deliver. If it's not that, and that's when you can pull from anywhere, not necessarily outside of the industry, meaning medtech as a whole, a regulated industry. But, there are transferable skill sets from different therapies that you can pull from if you're looking for a solid leader. Typically speaking, it is someone's looking for that black book with the knowledge, right? So when you talk about heart valves and interventional cardiology, I mean, a lot of those companies are looking for somebody who knows the physicians, who knows the docs, who can come in and say, okay, we're going to put the sales plan together, but I know Marty Leon, or I know next KOL, and I'm going to be able to knock on their door real quickly and start getting letters of intent, or whatever it may be. Same thing pretty much in, there's a lot of clubby therapies, like orthopedics is one for sure. Surgical robotics is getting to be one, where it's getting less and less transferable skill set, where I need someone who's good at X, Y, and Z skill sets to be able to transfer from therapy to therapy. And it's getting a lot more about who do you know, and then are you a good person after that that can implement strategies. So that's one of the things that I ask for on commercialization.
Okay. I want to switch gears back to funding in a second here, but something that, at Project Medtech, we work with pre-seed through Series A companies a lot, especially on that consulting side, right? And something that a hard discussion that comes up with some of the founders is, hey, just so you know, you might not be the CEO of this company post Series A, even even after you raise the Series A, theoretically you could be replaced then, right? They might be even if you've done nothing wrong, right? You might just not. They might have someone else in mind that they know has taken companies from A to exit, whatever it is, right? Do you do a lot of recruitment in that space? Let me ask you that first. I mean, are you placing CEOs of startup companies?
Regularly, yes.
Okay. How sensitive of a placement is that with, are the founders consulted? I mean, is that awkward? Are you looking for someone to complement those founders' skill set, because they're probably taking a step back into a different position? Maybe it's CTO, maybe it's CSO. I don't know, but I'm just curious in this process. I haven't been through one where I've watched this kind of evolve, but I've also heard a number of stories of people who are like, yep, I raised the money, and the board ultimately decided that it wasn't me to kind of run to pilot the plane, I guess, right? And they kind of moved on. So what is that like? I mean, any insight there I think is valuable. Why the change? I don't know. I'm just curious on this. And it's an ambiguous question.
The most optimal situation that I've seen is when it's the founder's decision and they know they've hit this glass ceiling, and it's their choice, that they have realized that they've hit the glass ceiling and they want somebody to come in who's been there and done that before to better the company and for the betterment of the company's future. When it's a forced decision, it's rarely pretty. I've seen when it's a forced decision, meaning the board came in and said, step aside, Mr. or Mrs. Founder, We need somebody who's going to take this over the line because we got to protect our investment. And they keep on in some capacity, meaning the original founders, but it's if it's not the founder's acknowledgement that he or she is capped out, and for the betterment of the company, they should bring in external talent to be able to bring this over the line and protect everyone's money. That's really when a good replacement should come in here. And also there's an amazing article called The Founder's Dilemma. It's a Harvard Business Review article. And in there, they highlight a theory. It's called the rich versus king theory, which basically amounts to control versus money, right? So when you're a founder, whether it's an engineer or a physician or whatever, you bring the company to as far as you can. And by the way, quick sidestep, I mean, we've even had him on our podcast. It's very possible for a founder to initiate and found a technology, build a company around that technology, and actually take it through commercialization. Luca Ravanon, who we recently released out of Italy, amazing founder, scientist in neuromodulation, self-proclaimed, saying that how different an R&D company is versus a commercialization company. And he went from being an R&D engineer and scientist, founded the company, got his MBA because he realized that he wanted to back away or walk away from the technology side, always being able to contribute if and when needed, but actually building a company from a business standpoint, taking it through commercialization. I think that's another question to ask is, as a founder, when we come up to that inflection point, and typically if you're a technical founder, you have to make that decision. Do you want to always remain close to the technology? And if that is the case, then you should come to the self-realization that you should hire somebody or bring somebody in who's going to continue taking this further, that you won't be able to do. If you want to be able to grow and take the company, and it really does force you to walk away from the technology, at least on a hands-on day-to-day basis, where you're building a team to take care of that, and you're really more focused, probably 90% at this point, of building the company, if not more, that's when you could take a stab at it yourself. However, to answer your question, and this was a long way of answering, so when the decision is forced upon the founder to be replaced, it usually ends pretty toxically. Okay. The self-realization of the founder that he or she is capped out, and going back to this rich versus king theory, rich is knowing that everyone's equity is going to be worth much, much more if it's taking your ego out of the way and putting talent where it should be to be able to ultimately objectively take this technology, deliver it over the line, whether it's through acquisition or IPO and ultimately to patients. But that's when your rich theory comes in, where it's not about you, it's about your equity. And how are you going to build that value in your equity? It may not be you bringing all the value. It may be somebody else, but at least your value is going to be worth, or your equity is going to be worth something. The king theory is all about control. I'm going to do it. I can do it. Watch me roar. And I would rather have 1% of $100 million than 100% or 50% of $0, right? I think we all agree with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. You brought up Luca. I mean, Luca is a great example, and we talked to so many others who will take it from founder, through commercialization and on to commercialization. Then we talked to people like Todd Usen from Active Surgical, right, who came in post Series A, and he's now raised like what, $77 million. But that's his thing, and that's another great example of maybe realizing the ceiling and bringing someone else in who could take you to the next step.
100%.
So back to fundraising a bit, and just as a reminder to anyone listening, if you have questions, please pop them in, and we can start asking some of those as well. I want to talk about, we were back at the seed Series A, but at any point in time when you're raising capital, I think there's probably a transition somewhere of like, as you get further down, I don't know if raising capital gets easier, but checks probably get larger. You get more VCs, strategics, others coming in, and once you get one, usually some others follow, right? And they kind of syndicate on there. But at the beginning, sometimes it's very frustrating for companies in a seed round, a Series A, if they're just starting out and raising capital, Talk a little bit about good money versus bad money. I knew of those two, but I think I've heard you talk about neutral money as well on the podcast with some of the investors. Can you just kind of break that down a little bit? Because I think sometimes startups take any money and could really, really hurt you later on. And I've seen that play out a lot. So maybe just touch on this subject of good money, bad money, neutral money. And maybe I'm just adding neutral money because I heard someone else say it, but I swear I've heard it on the podcast.
Yes, I think simply put, and then we can dive into them individualistically.
Yeah.
So bad money is money with a motive that doesn't align with the board of directors or the company's long-term goals.
Mm-hmm.
And really what that means is, typically speaking, or generally speaking, there's a VC board member who is getting pressure internally from their partners to sell off the company. They need to return the money to the limited partners for their fund, and their focus of, we just need to sell off this company for our venture capital fund to either save face or return the fund or whatever it may be. That's where that pressure comes in. And then all of a sudden you feel that pressure being put on the startup, and sometimes, and more often than not, it's prematurely. And then there's this dissonance either amongst the board, which is usually made up of the founders, or at least executive management and the investors on the board, and sometimes other independents. And there's this ability to create this pressure where it's really bad for the company. Sometimes the board of directors can totally derail the original strategy or a good strategy of a company and ultimately hurt the company. That's bad money. That's really bad money. Good money is money that it's more than just a check, right? At the end of the day, you need capital to keep the doors open. But for example, we've interviewed corporate venture capitalists, and I'm just using this as an example because traditional or institutional VCs also provide added value. But when you hear of Oliver Keown out of Intuitive Ventures, or Eric Hines from Smith and Nephew, right? When you come in and you take on corporate venture capital money, you not only get a check from them, but you're also getting access to regulatory or sometimes manufacturing and R&D partnerships, or quality, right? So good money is the value added beyond simply the number and the capital that you're receiving from, that you're getting from that investor. Neutral money is really what it sounds like. It's money, and there's really not much value beyond, because they're not the experts in that field, and they also don't have a vested interest enough, or they don't sit on the board where they really have the possibility to make it bad money. If anyone's listening in on this and I'm stepping sideways, correct me. From what I've learned and what I've heard, and even dealing with family offices directly, typically speaking, if there's family offices out there who are representing billions and billions of dollars, or at least hundreds of millions, first and foremost, a fun thing to think about with family offices is when they invest 2 or 3 million or 10 million into a startup company, and they get a multiple of 50 million, of 5, and you turn their 10 into 50 million, for example. At the end of the day, when you're managing $1 billion family office or 700 million family office, and you get 50 million, or you lose 5 million or 10 million, it doesn't really move the needle. Like, you're not going to change their life, right? So when you hear of these family offices, they may provide some value. There might be connections that they just have organically, but typically speaking, family offices aren't geared solely towards one industry. They invest regionally. They want to benefit their local companies or innovators, typically speaking. And they might invest in food and biopharma and automotion or automotive companies, in addition to medtech companies. So you're not going to be getting this plethora of really in-depth value beyond simply the check that they're going to write. And if you're a heart failure company and the father of the family happened to pass away from heart failure, they might be, in their minds, philanthropically, or what they call now impact investing into that company, because there's a family connection there. And they feel good about investing that capital into that company because their family was affected by cancer or heart failure or blindness, whatever it may be. And once again, because that investment's not going to necessarily move the needle tremendously, not to say that they don't care about their investment, but they're not going to be very active like a VC would, or sometimes even an angel who has enough experience in there, and also offer the same value that a corporate venture capital would be in terms of their added value from their services that a CVC could versus a family office. So neutral money, it's simply capital.
Okay, that's good. So we got one question in while we were chatting there, and it was, could you share some best practices to connect with first investors in medtech, considering that opening the first door is one of the most important steps in the VC raise? While you're thinking about this, my quick answer is, you know how you shared about the black book for commercialization, people who know people. I think this is uberly important here as well, is warm introductions go a long way. But I'm curious on from your side, what are some of those other best practices, you know, getting in the door with some of these investors, because it is hard.
It's very hard. And once again, from the podcast and also all the startups that we deal with, there's always going to be people who say you have to try everything. And when it boils down to fundraising is sales, right? So all the cliche things that we're going to hear time and time again, you got to get used to no's. However, what I would suggest is, while you need to be able to test the waters and you never know where it's going to come from, you really do never know where it's going to come from. The value of warm introductions is absolutely massive. We've heard that time and time again. I would say, from a first-time entrepreneur raising capital, it's the little things that you'd be surprised on. And it's kind of like learning a language, a brand new language. If you commit to learning 5 new words a week, by the end of the year, you learn, what is that, 250, 2,500, I'm sorry, 5 times 52, what am I talking, 250, 260 words in a year, right? I mean, that's semi-conversational, right? I mean, if you even played that softer and say, I'm going to learn 1 new investor a week, I'm going to add, and I have an entrepreneurial friend, or you join an accelerator and you say, introduce me to 1 new investor, or you look into an investor's website and you look at their portfolio company and you realize that they've invested into another orthopedic company, and you happen to know the physician on that board, whatever it may be, you ask for that introduction. People give introductions. And so even if you get 1 new investor a week, that's 52 new investors if you methodically did it every year. If you knew 52 relevant investors, which, if you hear some of the strategies from some of these people who raise tens of millions or hundreds of millions, they typically start off, they test the water. I'm going to reach out to these 5, or these 8 are really intricate for me, or integral for me. If you have an actual network of 52 investors that could possibly be relevant to you, and you have a warm introduction that can get you in there, that's gold. So while there are there's a lot of proclaimers out there that, you dedicate 2 full days, you put your seatbelt in, and you send out 1,000 emails because you never know when the cold email is going to come back saying, I'm interested. That's fine, but it's also a somewhat lucky approach. You're really basing on numbers, where we just released an amazing podcast with Manuel Opitz, who talks about how he does investor due diligence. He goes into investors that he finds or thinks are interesting, looks at the portfolio companies, connects with those CEOs of those companies, and actually asks the CEOs about how those investors act after they made an investment. What was the process like? What was their due diligence like? Oh, they're on your board. How do they act once the investment's made? And then you do actual investor due diligence on those investors to see, is that good money or bad money? But also, even more importantly, you're creating a relationship with that other CEO who you're calling about those investors, and maybe they make an introduction for you. But the warm introductions are huge. And also, if you have extra time, which most entrepreneurs raising capital don't, you find a list somewhere and you want to send out 1,000 emails or 100 emails, all that you're going to hear is a bunch of no's, and you might get 1 or 2 calls.
Yeah, I think so. You had put together that list, I don't know, was that a year ago or 2 years ago? And it had, 1,000+ investors on it. And I'd get people who reach out, hey, can we get the list? And Giovanni was very liberal with who he sent that. I mean, he sent it to anybody, right? You want it, you can have it. And I think people were like, oh, great, I can ping all 1,000 of these investors, and that's the value. And that was probably, I know that was wrong, right? The value in that is you have the list, and now you can actually dig through and say, oh, look, they've made investments similar to mine. Okay, great. They invest in pre-seed and Series A. Oh, they just launched a new fund, right? It was kind of actually just a starting point to do more research. And then it became, oh, hey, can maybe I can get an intro to this person. And we've had people reach out, via the podcast, and hey, can we get an intro to this investor? It's like, sure. Did you listen to the episode? Oh, well, no, not yet. Well, you should probably listen to the episode, right? I mean, they talked for an hour about why they invest in startups. You should probably listen to that. I don't know why you wouldn't listen to that, because that's how you can personalize an email. So it's funny. It seems like it's a no-brainer, but we still have people who don't do it that way, and it's lazy. If you're going to be lazy, you're probably not going to be successful with raising capital. But now I appreciate that feedback on the list, because we do get that quite often, where people just want a list of investors. So I think that probably answered that person's questions. We don't have another one in yet, but one question that I wanted to make sure I got this in is trends in startup fundraising. Are we seeing more money come in? Are we seeing other investors come in that weren't in medtech because of digital health? What are some of those trends? And the reason I ask is we've had a lot of, I don't know about unicorns, because they're not exits, but they're unicorns in the fact that the way they've been able to raise money, right? Someone like Daniel Hawkins, who was episode 50, he raised $100 million via Zoom. I mean, that's not most people's reality, right? So I'm curious, you hear a story like that and you're like, wow, things must be great. I don't know the data. I don't know if you know the data or not, but what are the trends? Is more money coming in? Are people coming in from other industries? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so I think we can't look at it on like a today basis anymore. I mean, if we look at what COVID's done, in the very beginning, we didn't know if people were going to invest without being in person, right? We proved that wrong pretty quickly. You just talked about how Daniel raised $100 million over Zoom. So that happened. 2020 was a banner year. But the thing that we walk away with is there's really not a person on the planet at this point that doesn't know about healthcare now that we've had this global pandemic. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of either generalists of investors enter into this healthcare world. And we also have seen alternative style of new styles of investors. Hospital systems are actually creating venture arms. More and more CVCs, corporate venture capital, are being created. Just think about in the past 2 years, Intuitive Surgical created their own venture arm. Dexcom created their own venture arm. You're getting more and more CVCs coming online. But in addition to that, you're hearing hospital systems who are now getting involved into making investments to augment or improve technologies that can be used in the hospital, whether they're IT services, diagnostics, whatever it may be. So I think more money has been poured into, certainly more money has been poured into the industry. I think the rounds have been getting larger. In addition to, there's more optionality that investors have, or I should say entrepreneurs have, to raise capital. Like, once again, going from not only limited to angel groups and venture capitals, but you have family offices, you have hospital systems, you have there's another one that's out of New York that I just had a call with last week that is a hedge fund who's now getting involved in Series A financing for medtech startups. So you have hedge funds, which predominantly were known for public markets or big assets. So a lot of eyes are getting involved in crowdfunding, right? I mean, crowdfunding doesn't work for every medtech company, that's for sure. Fortunately, we do have a great story on our podcast series about what it really means to be a medtech company and the capabilities as well as limitations of crowdfunding. That was Kelly Roman, if anyone wants to check that one out. But I would say the trends are that there is not only one or two ways to raise capital anymore. You have a plethora of ways to raise capital. And I think other trends which recently came out, MedTech innovator Paul Grand commented, and that was actually an article in MedTech Strategist, that there's more and more direct-to-consumer or non-regulated companies that are in this healthcare space, or 510Ks versus certainly the lower numbers of class threes. So you're talking about a lot of healthcare investors, which may not be necessarily med tech investors. So going back to what we talked about earlier, are you a software company? Are you a service company? Are you an actual tangible medical device company? Are you a direct to consumer style of healthcare technology? Are you regulated? All those things are falling under this umbrella of healthcare investors, which we're now getting a lot of new investors from, as I just mentioned. But it really goes back to doing that homework, like we have been alluding to, of like find your style of investor, because there are differences amongst investors, whether it's software, services, implantables, diagnostics, whatever it may be. So the trend is that there's a lot more innovation happening in healthcare, and it's attracting a lot more various types of investors. But fundamentally, once you start targeting your style of investor, if you are an entrepreneur, know who invests in your style, because diagnostic investors typically won't invest in implantables, and implantables typically won't invest in SaaS and things like that. So you have to stay focused on that.
Awesome. So we're coming up to the top of the hour here. We got one more question, and I want to make sure we get to that. We've talked a lot about the podcast, so we have to plug the fact that Galen has been on 4 episodes of the podcast, right? So on Project Medtech, Chris DuPont, the CEO and co-founder of Galen Data, is episode 27. Abbas, the CTO of Galen, is episode 60 and 62. And then on the MedTech Money side, Chris also appeared on there about raising a Series A for Galen. So it's a pretty cool story if you want to check that out. But that's episode 15 on the MedTech Money side. So Giovanni, real quick, do you have a hard stop at 2 o'clock here? Okay, so if people have questions, keep funneling them in if you'd like. One of the questions we just got was, how would one go about finding the right person or company to work with to get a product to market if you have patented the idea and moving forward you don't have experience with?
And moving forward you don't have experience with. So you're a founder, you have a patented idea, and you want to take it to the next level?
Yep.
I mean, one of two simple things. I mean, that's a big problem. And I don't know if that was a physician, or it could be, sounds like one.
Yeah.
But anyway, typically speaking is you have to find a co-founder who's willing and interested in taking that to the next level, or pending time, enter into an accelerator program.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Awesome. Well, I think that is perfect timing because we have 1 minute till the top of the hour. So first off, we got to thank Galen Data for putting these on. It was, like I said, this is the 19th installment of it. I have started. I started coming to these in June of last year, somewhere about there, and they're incredibly valuable. The topics that Galen has every month are generally pretty hot areas in the medtech space, and so we just want to thank them for giving it a platform to put some of this information out there into the universe and talk to intelligent people like yourself, Giovanni. So thank you for your time today, and giving a state of the union, I guess, if you will, on funding and talent in the medtech space. For those who are still on, you can head over to galendata.com, and I believe even if you didn't sign up for this webinar, you can sign up for past ones if there was a recording you wanted to check out, or if someone you know should be listening to this one. But with that being said, thanks everyone for joining today, and have a great day.